My name is Annalise Thorne, and I am now 72 years old. I'm speaking to you from the quiet of my study in London, a room filled not with needlepoint and porcelain dolls, but with geological maps, calipers, and the silent, stony stare of creatures who lived and died millions of years before a single human being ever walked the earth. For most of my life, these creatures, my fossils, were a source of shame, a mark of my strangeness, the proof of my godlessness in the eyes of my family. I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined that these very same godless monsters would one day become my salvation, and in doing so, would reveal the hollowness of the provincial little kingdom my family had built for themselves on the coast of Lyme Regis. The story of how my family's greatest shame became my greatest triumph is not just about rocks and bones, it's about the sweet, slow, and undeniable revenge of a life lived authentically. Before I dive into how a lonely woman on a windswept coast managed to overturn an entire family's legacy with nothing but a chipping hammer and a stubborn heart, I'd love to know where you're all watching from today. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever felt overlooked or had a passion that no one else seemed to understand, go ahead and hit that like button, because I suspect you'll know exactly the kind of quiet corridors I walked for so many years. For all the new viewers, make sure you subscribe, because this is a community for people who know that sometimes the things others discard are the most valuable treasures of all. My story begins not with a bang, but with the hiss of the tide pulling pebbles back into the sea. I was born and raised in Lyme Regis, a town caught between the churning English Channel and the rolling green hills of Dorset. Our house, a sturdy stone affair built to withstand the gales, sat on a parcel of land that ended abruptly at the cliffs. To my father, Josiah Thorne, that land represented stability, prosperity, and God's providence. He was a merchant of some local standing, a man whose piety was as rigid and unyielding as the church pews he occupied every Sunday. To him, the world was a finished product created in 7 days, perfect and complete. The Bible was not a guide, it was an instruction manual for reality, and he was its most devoted foreman. My mother, Patience, was aptly named. She was a woman of quiet anxieties, her life's purpose narrowed to maintaining our family's reputation and upholding my father's severe worldview. And then there was my brother Gideon, 2 years my senior. From birth he was the heir, the future of the Thorne name and fortune. He was bright and charming in the way people who have never been denied anything often are, and he moved through the world with an unshakable confidence that I could only watch with a sense of baffled wonder. And then there was me, Annalise, the quiet girl, the strange daughter. My fascination began when I was just 6 years old. While Gideon was learning sums and practicing the confident penmanship expected of a future merchant, I was drawn to the shore. The beach was my real classroom. After a good storm, the gray cliffs would weep clay and shale onto the beaches, and among the common stones and sea-worn glass there were treasures. They were spiral-shaped stones like coiled snakes, and long ridged cones and strange star-shaped pieces that fit perfectly in the palm of my hand. I didn't know what they were. Not then. I only knew they felt ancient, that they held a secret, the waves whispered but never fully told. I found my first significant piece on a blustery Tuesday. It was a perfect ammonite, the size of a bread plate, its intricate ribbed spiral gleaming with a pearly iridescence where the sea had polished it smooth. I was ecstatic. I ran home, my small hands struggling to hold my prize, my heart thumping with the thrill of discovery. I burst into my father's study, a room that always smelled of ledgers and dry ink. "Father, look what I found." I held it out to him, beaming, expecting him to share my wonder. He put down his pen and looked at the fossil. His face, usually set in lines of stern concentration, darkened. He took the stone from me, his grip uncharacteristically tight. He turned it over and over, his thumb tracing the perfect, impossible spiral. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low and cold. "On the beach, below Black Ven. Isn't it a marvel?" I chirped, oblivious. He stood up, walked to the hearth, and without a word, he raised the ammonite and smashed it against the stone mantelpiece. It shattered into a dozen dull, gray fragments. The beautiful iridescence was gone, replaced by the flat, dead color of broken rock. I cried out, a sharp, wounded sound. My father turned to me, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. "Do not bring such things into this house again, Annalise," he commanded. "These are devil's tricks, lies in stone, meant to tempt man away from the truth of Genesis. God's creation is perfect, it does not change. It does not leave behind monstrous, twisted things like this. This is a blasphemy. Do you understand?" I could only nod, tears streaming down my face, my gaze fixed on the rubble of my beautiful treasure on the hearth. That was my first lesson. The world held two truths, the one in my father's Bible and the one I could hold in my hand, and in our house they could not coexist. My father's act of destruction didn't cure my curiosity, it only taught me to hide it. My passion for the fossils became a secret, clandestine affair. The cliffs and the beaches became my private world, a place where I could be myself, away from the suffocating piety of our home. I learned to read the tides and the weather. I learned which layers of shale were most promising after a hard rain. I began to build a collection, hiding my finds in a small, dry cave I discovered at the base of the cliffs, accessible only at low tide. This secret life continued through my adolescence. While Gideon was being praised for his acumen with the family business, and my mother was fretting over my disinterest in embroidery and social calls, I was meticulously cleaning the clay from the vertebrae of some long-extinct sea creature. I started to acquire books, smuggled in from a bookseller in Exeter who didn't ask questions. I learned the names for my treasures: ammonite, belemnite, gryphea. I began to understand that these were not devil's tricks, but the remains of life itself. The world was not a finished product. It was a story, written in layers of rock, and I was one of its few devoted readers. The inevitable discovery of my secret world happened when I was 16. Gideon, ever my father's eyes and ears, had grown suspicious of my long, solitary walks. He followed me one day. I was so engrossed in excavating a small, articulated fossil fish from a slab of shale that I never heard him approach. I remember the shadow falling over me, and the smug, triumphant look on his face. So this is what our little saint does with her time. Playing with pagan idols in the mud. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His quiet, cutting tone was far worse. He watched me for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward the house. I knew what was coming. I frantically gathered what I could, my hands shaking, and moved my most precious finds deeper into the cave. But it was a futile gesture. That evening, my father summoned me to his study. Gideon stood by the fireplace, the very picture of righteous concern. My small collection of books on geology and anatomy was piled on my father's desk. "Gideon tells me you have continued in your blasphemous pursuits," my father began, his voice dangerously calm. "He tells me you have a hoard of these things. Is this true?" I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my eyes fixed on my precious books. He picked one up, its cover depicting the skeleton of a lizard-like creature. He flipped through the pages with disgust. "Sedition, lies that strike at the very heart of God's word. You have allowed this poison to fester in your mind, under my own roof." The punishment was swift and theatrical. He marched me out to the back garden, carrying the books. He made Gideon fetch my hidden collection from the cave. It wasn't much, perhaps 30 or 40 pieces I had carefully wrapped in cloth, but it was my entire world. He built a small bonfire, and into it he threw my books, one by one. I watched the illustrations of ancient life curl and blacken, the words of science turning to ash. Then came the fossils. He made me watch as he tossed each one into the flames. The heat caused some of the stones to crack and spit, as if the creatures inside were crying out. Through it all he lectured me, his voice rising with fervor, about vanity, about intellectual pride, about the damnation that awaited those who questioned God's perfect plan. My mother stood at the kitchen door, wringing her hands, her face a mask of distress, but she said nothing. She never said anything. When it was over, and the fire had died down to embers, my father grabbed my arm. "If I ever find you are pursuing this again, I will send you to a madhouse. I will have this obsession beaten out of you. You will be a proper daughter of this house, or you will be nothing." That night, I didn't cry. The tears had been burned out of me. A cold, hard resolve settled in my chest, solid and heavy as a fossil. He had not burned my passion. He had only fired it into something stronger, something that would never break again. I would not stop. I would simply become a better secret keeper. The years that followed were a long, gray expanse of quiet rebellion. I played the part of the dutiful daughter. I went to church. I helped my mother around the house. I sat through excruciatingly dull dinners with my father's business associates. But my heart and mind were always elsewhere, on the coast. I found a new hiding place, an abandoned fisherman's hut on a remote stretch of beach, far from our property. It became my laboratory, my museum, my sanctuary. My collection grew, slowly and carefully. I became an expert in my own right, though I had no one to share it with. I learned to identify species, to understand the stratigraphy of the cliffs, to predict where the next storm might reveal something new. In town, my reputation curdled. I was in my early 20s, then my late 20s, with no prospects for marriage. My strange, solitary habits were the subject of gossip. The family made a few half-hearted attempts to marry me off. One suitor, a timid young curate named Mr. Blythe, was brought to tea. He spoke at length about the moral fortitude of the barnacle, which cleaves to its rock for its entire life. In a moment of sheer, unadulterated boredom, I pulled a small, polished ammonite from my pocket. "And what of this, Mr. Blythe?" I asked. "It lived a life of freedom in the ancient seas. Is there not a lesson in that too?" He stared at the fossil, as if I had produced a venomous snake. He went pale, stammered an excuse, and left within the quarter hour. He never returned. My mother wept. My father's silence was a condemnation that lasted for weeks. Gideon laughed about it, scared him off with a demon snail. "Did you, Annie? You'll die a spinster in this house." His words were meant to be a curse, but they became my reality. I became a fixture of the house, quiet and unobtrusive as an old piece of furniture. To my family, I was a failure, a permanent resident of the debit side of my father's social ledger. They provided me with room and board, and in return, I was expected to be invisible, to not cause any more embarrassment. This arrangement, meant to be my prison, was in fact my liberation. They ignored me so completely that I was free. I spent almost every daylight hour out on the cliffs. I became a known eccentric in Lyme Regis. Mad Annie, the children would sometimes call out, "Gone to look for dragon bones." I didn't mind. Their taunts were a small price to pay for my freedom. My only real human connection in those years was with an old fisherman named Silas Colmer. He was a man whose skin was as weathered as the cliffs themselves, his eyes the same gray blue as the winter sea. He never judged me. He'd see me out on the beach in the foulest weather, chipping away at a rock, and he would just nod, a small smile playing on his lips. One day he called me over to his boat. "Found this in the nets," he grunted, and pressed a heavy, lumpy object into my hands. It was a nodule of rock, but I knew from its weight and shape what it was. Later, in the privacy of my hut, I carefully cracked it open. Inside was the skull of a fish, its teeth still sharp, its eye socket staring out from an imprisonment of 180 million years. Silas had seen its potential. He had seen me. A few weeks later, I found him mending his nets. I tried to thank him, but he just waved it away. He squinted out at the sea, then looked at me. "Don't you let them grind you down, girl," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That father of yours, he sees God in a book, thinks he can lock him in a box of words. Some of us see his work in the bones of the earth, in things that tell a story older than any book. You keep listening to that story, you hear?" It was the most profound validation I had ever received. A simple fisherman had understood what my own family, in all their zealous piety, never could. I was not a blasphemer. I was a storyteller, and my language was stone. The winter I turned 34 was one of the most brutal in living memory. The winds howled for weeks, and the sea, in its fury, clawed at the base of the cliffs. The rain came down in relentless sheets, saturating the land, making it heavy and unstable. We all knew something had to give. The end came one night in late January. It wasn't a loud crash, but a deep, groaning shudder that shook the entire house. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. We all woke, and my father and Gideon, lanterns in hand, went out to inspect the property. They came back, their faces pale in the flickering light. A massive section of the cliff at the far end of our land, a section that had stood for centuries, had given way. A great scar of raw blue-gray clay was now exposed to the world, a wound in the landscape half a mile long. To my father, it was a disaster, a loss of valuable grazing land, a dangerous instability. To me, hearing the news from my bedroom, it was a miracle. A door had just been opened, a door into a world that had been sealed for millions of years. I knew, with a certainty that made my hands tremble, that my life was about to change. For the next 2 months, the landslide became my obsession. I was up before dawn each day, slipping out of the house while my family slept. I told them I was helping to clear fallen trees from the public footpaths, a suitably charitable and mundane excuse that they accepted without question. The reality was far different. I was engaged in the most important work of my life. The newly exposed layer of blue lias clay was a treasure trove. It was a perfect snapshot of an ancient Jurassic seabed, and it was littered with the dead. I found ammonites bigger than cartwheels, clusters of belemnites like fossilized bundles of cigars, and the scattered remains of fish and smaller marine reptiles. I worked with a frantic, feverish energy, my hands raw, my muscles aching. I knew this window of opportunity was fleeting. Soon, the rain and the tides would erode the new surface, or the remaining cliff face would collapse further, burying it all once more. And then, one cold March morning, my hammer struck something different. It wasn't the sharp crack of striking a loose nodule. It was a dull, solid thud. I cleared away the surrounding clay and shale, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a bone, a vertebra thicker than my wrist. I followed the line of it, digging carefully, my heart hammering against my ribs. Another vertebra, and another, forming a great curving spine that disappeared into the clay. I spent the next 3 weeks in a state of suspended reality. Every day I returned to the spot, carefully, painstakingly excavating my find. What emerged from the clay was a monster, a sea dragon, a nearly complete skeleton of an ichthyosaur, its skull a full 6 feet long, its paddle-like fins folded at its sides, its backbone curving away for what I estimated to be over 30 feet. It was a creature of terrifying and sublime beauty locked in stone. It was the culmination of my entire life's secret passion. I had no idea what to do with it. It was too big to move, too magnificent to hide forever. I covered it as best I could with old tarps and canvas, weighted down with rocks, and prayed for guidance that I knew I would not find in my father's church. The answer to my unspoken prayer arrived not in a clap of thunder, but in a sealed envelope from London. It was addressed to my father. He opened it at the dinner table, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read. "Well," he said, a note of pride creeping into his voice. "It seems we are to have distinguished visitors." He explained that 2 scholars from the Royal Society in London, a Professor Alistair Finch and a Dr. Henry Davis, were touring the Dorset coast. They were geologists, he said, studying the effects of the recent storms on the coastal formations. They had written to request his permission, as a prominent landowner, to survey the cliffs on our property. For my father, this was a magnificent opportunity to host men of learning from the capital, to be seen as a patron of science. It was a chance to burnish his reputation, to elevate the Thorne name. He immediately began making preparations, instructing my mother on the best linens and the menus for their stay. To me, he issued a single, stern command. "Annalise, you will make yourself scarce. I will not have you bothering these important men with your childish nonsense about magical stones. You will not embarrass this family. Is that understood?" I nodded, my face a carefully constructed mask of obedience. Inside, a storm of terror and hope raged. The experts were coming. They were coming to my beach, to my cliff, to my monster. It was the chance of a lifetime, a chance to have my work, my passion, seen and understood by people who would not call it blasphemy. But it was also a terrifying risk. To reveal my secret would be to defy my father in the most profound way imaginable, and I did not know if I had the courage. The scholars arrived a week later. Professor Finch was a tall, lean man in his late 50s with a fringe of gray hair and eyes that seemed to be constantly observing and cataloging everything they saw. Dr. Davies was younger, broader, with an infectious, boyish enthusiasm. They were polite and formal with my father, praising his hospitality and the rugged beauty of the coastline. My father basked in their attention, playing the part of the enlightened country squire. For 2 days I watched them from a distance. I saw them on the public beaches, splitting rocks with their hammers, examining fragments with their magnifying glasses, their conversation a low murmur of academic terms that were music to my ears. They seemed disappointed. The public areas had been picked over for years. They were finding nothing of real significance. I stayed hidden, a ghost in my own home, my secret lying under a tarp just a few hundred yards from where they stood. The weight of it was crushing me. Fear and longing warred within me. Fear of my father's wrath, of a lifetime of scorn and ridicule if I was wrong. But the longing to know, to have my discovery validated, was a physical ache. The tipping point came, as it so often did, from Gideon. He found me in the back garden, staring out at the gray sea, my hands clenched at my sides. He had a cruel, knowing smirk on his face. He had seen me watching the scholars, hiding from the real men of science, sister, he taunted, his voice low and laced with contempt. What's the matter? Afraid they'll confirm that your precious collection of pebbles is just that? A pile of worthless rocks? Afraid they'll laugh at you? He leaned closer. They're leaving tomorrow, you know. Back to London, where real work is done. This is your last chance to make a complete fool of yourself and drag the family name through the mud with you. He laughed and walked away, pleased with his little jab. But his words had the opposite effect he intended. He thought he was shaming me into continued silence. Instead, he lit a fire. He was right. It was my last chance. And in that moment, the fear of my father, the fear of ridicule, all of it, was finally eclipsed by a greater fear, the fear of regret, the fear of spending the rest of my life in this gray, silent house, wondering what might have been, the fear of letting my monster, my beautiful, terrible sea dragon, lie unknown and unappreciated in the clay forever. That would be the true blasphemy. That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake, listening to the house settle around me, and I made a decision. My whole life had been lived in the shadows. Tomorrow, for better or worse, I would step into the light. The next afternoon was overcast and gray, the sky matching the churn of the sea. I watched from the parlor window as Professor Finch and Dr. Davies began packing their equipment into their carriage. My father and Gideon stood with them, making pleasant, final conversation. My father was glowing with self-satisfaction. He had successfully hosted the London academics, and his reputation was secure. Now was the moment. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, my palms slick with sweat. I felt my mother's hand on my arm. "Annalise, what are you doing? Leave them be." Her voice was a frightened whisper. I looked at her, at the fear etched into the lines around her eyes, a fear that had governed her entire life, and I knew I could not, would not, live like that. I gently removed her hand. "I have to," I said, and walked out the door. The four men turned as I approached, their conversation faltering. My father's face went rigid with fury. "Annalise, I told you," he began, his voice a low growl of warning. I ignored him. I walked directly to Professor Finch, my eyes fixed on his. My voice, when it came out, was shaky but clear. "Gentlemen, forgive my interruption. You may have been looking in the wrong place." Professor Finch blinked, surprised by my directness. Dr. Davies looked intrigued. My father, however, was mortified. He rushed to my side, grabbing my elbow in a punishing grip. "My sincerest apologies, Professor," he said, his voice strained with false bonhomie. "My daughter, she has an overactive imagination. She is not well. Annalise, go back to the house now." His fingers dug into my arm, a clear, painful command. But for the first time in my life, I did not flinch. I did not retreat. I stood my ground, pulling my arm from his grasp. I looked back at Professor Finch, my gaze unwavering. "My father is correct about one thing," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I have spent my life imagining. I have spent 30 years walking these cliffs, learning their secrets, and I am telling you, with all sincerity, that the most significant fossil discovery on this coast in the last century is lying under a canvas tarp not 50 yards from where we stand." There was a stunned silence. Finch and Davis exchanged a look. It was a look of deep skepticism, but it was mingled with a flicker of professional curiosity. They had found nothing. What was the harm in indulging the local eccentric for 5 minutes? It was Gideon who broke the silence, with a short, sharp laugh of derision. "Oh, this is rich," he sneered. "Our Annie has found a dragon. Do be careful, gentlemen, it might bite." But his mockery was lost on Professor Finch, who was now looking at me with a new intensity. He saw something in my eyes, not madness, but a desperate, burning conviction. "Miss Thorne," he said slowly, his voice cautious, "that is a very bold claim." "I know," I replied. "Please, let me show you." He hesitated for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "Very well, lead the way." My father made a strangled noise of protest, but the professor held up a hand. "Josiah, the girl has made a claim. We will see it." The word girl grated, but I let it pass. The walk to the landslide site was the longest 50 yards of my life. My father walked beside me, his face a thundercloud, hissing threats under his breath. "You have humiliated me. You have made a mockery of this family. When they are gone, you will answer for this, I swear to God." Gideon followed behind, a smug smirk on his face, anticipating my public downfall. Dr. Davies tried to make polite conversation, asking about the local flora, but the tension was too thick to cut with a knife. I said nothing. I just walked, my focus narrowed to the patch of weathered canvas ahead. We reached the spot. The tarps were just as I had left them, unassuming, lumpy shapes against the gray clay. "Here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I untied the ropes. I took a corner of the heavy canvas. For a second, I hesitated. This was it, the moment of truth or utter humiliation. I took a deep breath and pulled. The canvas slid away, revealing the section of the creature I had most fully excavated. the magnificent, terrifying head. The 6-foot-long skull, the enormous eye socket, the elongated jaw filled with 100 conical teeth. It was all there, laid bare under the flat gray light of the Dorset sky. There was a sound, a sharp collective intake of breath. Finch and Davies froze, their professional detachment shattering like glass. They stared, mouths agape. My father and Gideon, who had been expecting a pile of oddly shaped rocks, were struck dumb. Dr. Davies was the first to move. He dropped to his knees beside the skull, his hand hovering over the fossilized bone as if afraid to touch it. "My God," he whispered, the words a prayer. "Finch, look at the sclerotic ring. It's perfect." Professor Finch knelt on the other side, pulling a magnifying glass from his pocket. His earlier skepticism completely evaporated, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He ran a trembling finger along the edge of the jaw. "It's complete," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen a specimen this complete. The preservation is astonishing." They began firing questions, not at my father, the landowner, not at Gideon, the heir, but at me. "How did you find it? How did you excavate it without causing damage? What tools did you use? Have you found anything else?" For a few minutes I was overwhelmed, stammering answers about the landslide, the change in the clay, the way I followed the line of the vertebrae. And then Professor Finch stood up. He looked away from the incredible creature in the ground and looked directly at me. His eyes were filled with a respect that I had never, in my entire life, received from another human being. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice ringing with a new authority that silenced everyone. "This is a monumental discovery, but I have a feeling this is not the only thing you have to show us. Am I correct?" He paused, then asked the question that changed my life forever. "Can you show us your other work?" In that moment, the world shifted on its axis. My father, red-faced and sputtering, opened his mouth to say something, to reassert his authority, but no words came out. He and Gideon were suddenly irrelevant. They were just two men standing on a cliff, while the real conversation, the important conversation, was happening between me and the scholars from the Royal Society. They had been dismissed, and I, for the first time, had been seen. I led them away from the great ichthyosaur, leaving my father and brother standing beside it like statues, their faces a mixture of confusion and fury. We walked in silence along the coastal path to the dilapidated fisherman's hut that served as my secret museum. I was acutely aware of its humble appearance, the weathered wood, the peeling paint, the faint smell of salt and decay. I fumbled with the old iron key, my hands still shaking, and pushed open the door. Inside, the hut was dark and cool. I moved to the window and pulled back the thick canvas I used as a curtain, letting the gray afternoon light spill into the room. It was a single small space, but every inch of it was filled with my life's work. The walls were lined with rough-hewn shelves, and on those shelves, meticulously arranged, was my collection. There were hundreds of ammonites, organized by size and species, from tiny spirals no bigger than my thumbnail, to giants that I had to roll back to the hut on a makeshift sledge. There were shelves of belemnites, drawers filled with fossilized fish, some of them captured in the very act of swallowing their prey. On a large table in the center of the room were my more significant finds, articulated sections of smaller marine reptiles, skulls, paddles, vertebrae, all carefully cleaned and cataloged with handwritten labels noting the date and location of their discovery. Professor Finch and Dr. Davies stepped inside and simply stopped, their eyes wide. They moved through the small space with the reverence of men entering a cathedral. They picked up specimens, examining my labels, murmuring to each other in low, excited tones. "The sheer volume," Davies said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Look at the variety of species. She has things here I've only ever seen as fragments or in illustrations." Professor Finch was examining a small plesiosaur paddle I had spent a winter piecing together. He looked at my notes, which included my own tentative theories on its articulation and movement. He looked up at me, his expression one of profound astonishment. "Miss Thorne," he said, "this is not a collection. This is a body of research. You are not a hobbyist. You are a scientist." The word hung in the air, potent and unbelievable. Scientist, a word I had never dared to apply to myself. For the next 2 hours, the hut became a classroom, and I was the teacher. They asked me questions, not as one would indulge a child, but as one would consult a colleague. They wanted to know my theories on the depositional environment of the blue lias, my observations on the patterns of erosion, my techniques for extraction and preservation. I spoke, and they listened. Everything I had learned in secret, every observation I had made, every conclusion I had drawn in my lonely, silent pursuit, came pouring out of me. It was as if a dam had broken. For the first time, I was speaking my own language with people who understood it. We returned to the main house as dusk was falling. My father, mother, and Gideon were waiting in the parlor, a silent, tense tribunal. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken recriminations. Professor Finch, however, seemed oblivious to the family drama. He was energized, his mind clearly racing. He got straight to the point. "Josiah," he began, addressing my father but looking at me, "your daughter has made one of the most important paleontological discoveries of our time. The large specimen is magnificent, but her wider collection, it is of immense scientific value. It provides a picture of this prehistoric environment that is unparalleled." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The Royal Society will want to acquire all of it. The large skeleton, the entire collection in her laboratory, and we will want to fund a full-scale, professional excavation of the landslide site. We believe it to be a fossil bed of historical significance." My father's eyes widened. He could smell money and prestige. His anger at me began to morph into a greedy, proprietary gleam. "Well," he said, puffing out his chest, "I am of course happy to discuss the terms of the sale of my property's assets." Professor Finch held up a hand, stopping him cold. "There seems to be a misunderstanding, Josiah," he said, his tone polite but firm. "We will not be dealing with you." He turned his full attention to me. "Miss Thorne, the collection is the result of your labor, your knowledge, and your expertise. It is, by any reasonable definition, your intellectual and physical property. The large specimen was found on your family's land, yes, but its discovery and excavation are solely to your credit. Therefore, the Royal Society will negotiate only and directly with you." He then named a figure, an initial offer for the collection alone, that was so staggering, so astronomical that it sucked all the air out of the room. It was a sum that could buy and sell my father's entire mercantile business 3 times over. There was a dead silence. My mother made a small gasping sound. Gideon's jaw was slack with disbelief. My father's face went from red to a sickly, mottled white. The control he had wielded over me, over his entire family, for his entire life, was dissolving before his very eyes. He tried to reclaim it. "Now see here," he blustered, stepping forward. "I am the head of this household. I will not have my daughter, a simple spinster, dealing with such complex financial matters. I will handle this negotiation." It was the moment. The culmination of 34 years of being silenced, dismissed, and underestimated. I looked at my father, at his desperate, crumbling authority, and I felt not fear, but a profound and weary pity. I stepped in front of him, physically blocking his path to Professor Finch. "No, father," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. "You are not the head of this matter. For 30 years you have called my work nonsense, my finds blasphemies. They were my monsters, my shame. Well, now they are my fortune, and I will be the one to speak for them." I turned to Professor Finch. "Gentlemen, your offer is very generous, but before I accept, I will require a solicitor. From London. He will represent my interests." The finality in my tone was absolute. I was no longer Annalise, the strange daughter. I was Miss Thorne, a woman of means and science, and I was giving the orders. The look on my father's face was one I will never forget. It was the look of a king who had just watched his throne, his crown, and his kingdom turn to dust at his feet. A year can change everything. The following 12 months were a whirlwind of activity that felt more real and vibrant than the 34 years that had preceded them. I did, in fact, hire a solicitor from London, a sharp, no-nonsense man who ensured my interests were protected with an ironclad contract. The Thorne collection, as it came to be known, was sold to the Royal Society for a sum that secured my independence for the rest of my days. The great ichthyosaur, which the papers nicknamed the Lime Dragon, was painstakingly excavated, encased in plaster, and transported to London with the care one would afford a member of the royal family. I went with it. Leaving Lyme Regis, leaving my family home, was not the wrenching departure I might have once imagined. It felt like walking out of a cage. I did not look back. I found a small but comfortable house in Bloomsbury, near the British Museum, where my collection was to be housed. Professor Finch and Dr. Davies became my mentors, and eventually, my dear friends. They encouraged me to write, to document my findings and my methods. We co-authored several papers, my name appearing in print in the very scientific journals I once had to read in secret. The spinster with the overactive imagination was now a respected authority in her field. I was invited to lecture at scientific gatherings, my quiet, steady voice telling the story of the ancient seas to rooms full of learned men. none of whom called my work blasphemy. The Thorn Gallery at the British Museum became a sensation. People flocked to see the lime dragon, its magnificent skeleton reassembled and mounted, soaring over their heads. My collection, my beautiful secret treasures, were displayed in gleaming glass cases, each with a small card that read, "Discovered and catalogued by Miss Annalise Thorn." Seeing my name acknowledged and respected was a quiet, profound vindication that was worth more than any fortune. Back in Lyme Regis, the Thorn family's world had been turned upside down. My father's provincial wealth, once the source of his pride and standing, was now a pittance compared to mine. Their name was known throughout the country, but not for Josiah's piety or Gideon's business sense. They were known as the family of the famous fossil hunter Annalise Thorn. Everyone in town knew the story, of course. They knew how I had been scorned, how I had been called Mad Annie. My family's shame was now a public footnote to my success. They were elevated by my fame and simultaneously humiliated by the truth of how they had treated me. It was an irony so potent it was almost poetic. They came to visit me in London about a year after I had left. It was a profoundly awkward reunion. They arrived at my house, my father, mother, and Gideon, all dressed in their Sunday best, looking stiff and out of place amidst the city's hustle and bustle. They were timid as they stepped into my study, their eyes darting around at the books, the charts, the new specimens I was working on. This was my world, and they were aliens in it. My father cleared his throat, a sound I had once learned to fear, but which now sounded merely old and tired. He attempted an apology of sorts. "Annalise," he began, I have been thinking, perhaps my methods were harsh, but I see now that it was all part of God's plan. He was testing your resolve. My stern hand was merely the tool he used to forge your character." I just looked at him. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it, to reframe his cruelty as a divine service, was almost impressive. It was the ultimate comment bait of an apology, a masterpiece of self-serving revisionism. I didn't argue, I didn't rage. I simply said, "Thank you for your perspective, Father." My lack of emotional response seemed to unsettle him more than any argument would have. My mother just wept quietly into a handkerchief, as she always had. Gideon, my confident, swaggering brother, was the most changed. The smugness was gone, replaced by a sullen, humbled demeanor. After a painful silence, he finally got to the point of their visit. "Annalise," he mumbled, "the business, it's not doing so well. Shipping costs are up. I had an idea to expand, to buy a new warehouse, but the bank, they won't extend the credit." He couldn't quite meet my eyes. "I was wondering if you might consider an investment, a loan." I listened calmly. The old Annalise would have felt a rush of pity, a familial obligation to rescue them. But I was not the old Annalise. I looked at my brother, who had mocked me and tattled on me and delighted in my predicted failure, now coming to me for a handout. I did not feel anger, or even triumph. I simply felt a sense of clarity. "I will have my solicitor draw up the papers for a loan, Gideon," I said, my tone cool and professional. "He will outline the terms and a schedule for repayment, with interest. This will be a business transaction." The hope in his eyes died, replaced by a resentful understanding. I would help him, but not as a sister, not as family. I would help him as a banker would. I was drawing a boundary, clear and clean. I was capable of compassion, but I would no longer be their servant, their failure, their source of unearned support. My peace and my worth were no longer up for their negotiation. They left soon after, the transaction complete, the last vestiges of our old family dynamic shattered. I never felt lonely after they left. My home was filled with the silent companionship of creatures who had waited millions of years to tell their stories. I was their keeper, their translator, and I finally understood that my father had been wrong all those years ago. My fossils were not blasphemous. They were sacred. They were testaments to the endurance of life, to the vastness of time, and to the beautiful, undeniable truth that even things that are buried, ignored, and thought to be dead can one day be brought into the light and change the world. Looking back on it all now, from the quiet comfort of my old age, I realized that the years of ostracism were a strange kind of gift. Being so profoundly underestimated gave me a shield. Because no one thought what I was doing was important, no one bothered to interfere. My supposed madness was my camouflage. It gave me the freedom to pursue my passion with a single-mindedness I could never have achieved if I had been a proper daughter, wife, and mother. The most important lesson I learned is one that is carved not in stone, but in the heart. Your value is not determined by the opinions of others, especially not by those who are too blind to see it. It is something you excavate from within yourself, piece by painstaking piece, until you have built something so strong and so true that it can withstand any storm. So I want to ask all of you, have you ever had a passion that someone tried to shame you for? Share your story in the comments below, because these are the stories that give others the courage to keep digging. Don't forget to like this video if my journey resonated with you, and please subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the most unexpected places. Remember, sometimes the people who believe in you the least end up giving you the most powerful motivation of all. Let their doubt be the fuel that drives you, not the cage that contains you. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I wish you all the strength to honor the treasures you find, no matter what the rest of the world may call them.